Eleanor Hart signed the paper without reading the last line. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was past the age of caring what words meant when survival was the only currency left. Her hand didn't shake. Her jaw didn't tremble. She pressed the pen down hard, harder than necessary, like she was trying to leave a mark on something that would never belong to her. Caleb Rourke watched her sign his name into her life and felt nothing, or so he believed. Before we go further, if this story already has you feeling something, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single part. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Montana and to the night Eleanor Hart made the worst decision of her life. The ink was barely dry when Caleb Rourke pushed back from the table and walked to the window. He didn't offer her a hand, didn't pour her a drink, didn't say a single word that resembled congratulations or welcome or anything a man says to a woman he's just bound himself to. He stood with his back to her and looked out at the land, his land all of it, stretching flat and frozen under a Montana sky, the color of old iron, and Eleanor sat in the chair across from his desk and waited. She was good at waiting. Boston had taught her that. Boston had taught her a great many things. How to keep her voice level when men talked over her. How to fold her hands in her lap when they dismissed her opinions at the schoolhouse board meeting. How to smile at the mothers who pulled their daughters away from her classroom after Reverend Aldous told them from the pulpit no less on a Sunday morning in front of the whole congregation that a woman who argued with men about scripture and mathematics and the proper education of children was a woman who had forgotten her place before God. She had been 31 years old. She had been the best teacher Hargrove County had ever employed, and she lost her position in 11 minutes. That was 3 years ago. The jobs she found after seamstress laundress clerk in a dry goods store where the owner docked her pay every Friday for reasons he never explained had each lasted shorter than the last. And then came the letter. Not a letter of opportunity. A letter of pure, blunt transaction placed in her hand by a man who worked for a lawyer who worked for Caleb Rourke, and it said exactly what it meant without a single piece of decoration around it. A rancher in Glacier County, Montana, seeks a woman of education and sound mind to enter a private domestic arrangement. The terms are enclosed. The arrangement carries no romantic expectation and no public ceremony. The woman will be housed, clothed, and compensated annually. In exchange, she will manage the household, assist in correspondence and record-keeping, and be willing to bear a child to secure the rancher's line of inheritance. The arrangement dissolves at either party's discretion after 3 years, with full compensation rendered regardless. Reply only if serious. Eleanor had read it twice. Then she had folded it, placed it in her coat pocket, walked 4 blocks to the post office, and mailed her reply before she could talk herself out of it. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now she sat in Caleb Rourke's study in a house that was bigger than anything she'd grown up in, and colder than anything she'd ever felt. And she looked at the broad, rigid line of his shoulders and told herself she had made a reasonable decision. "There's a room prepared for you," he said finally without turning around. "Second door on the left at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Calloway, she helps with the cooking. She'll show you where things are kept." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "The agreement stands as written. You'll manage correspondence starting Monday. The ranch ledgers are behind you on the shelf. They're a mess, I'll warn you now. My last hand had no head for numbers." "I have a head for numbers." He turned then, just slightly. Not enough to look at her directly, but enough that she could see his profile, the hard jaw, the dark eyes, the lines around his mouth that didn't come from laughing. "I know," he said. "That's why I sent the letter." He crossed to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late. I don't wait." And he was gone. Eleanor sat alone in his study for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a small leather notebook, opened it to the first page, and wrote, "Day 1. Caleb Rourke speaks in commands. He does not make eye contact when he's uncomfortable. He turned his back on me the moment I signed. Note: A man who cannot face what he's done is a man who knows it costs something. She closed the notebook, straightened her spine. "Fine," she said to the empty room. "Let's begin." Mrs. Calloway was a short, round woman with red hands and sharp eyes, who had clearly been told the barest minimum about Eleanor's presence in the house, and had filled in the rest herself. She showed Eleanor the room, clean, sparse a bed with a wool blanket and a window that faced east, and said very little except that breakfast was at 5:30 and that Mr. Rourke did not like noise before he'd had his coffee. "What kind of noise?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Calloway looked at her as though she'd asked what color the sky was. "Any kind." "I see. And what does he like before coffee?" Silence. "That I can manage," Eleanor said. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." The older woman hesitated at the door. Something moved across her face, not quite pity, not quite curiosity. Then she said quiet enough that it felt like a confession. "He's not a cruel man, miss. He lost things. Makes a person go hard." "Most people lose things," Eleanor said. "Not the way he did." She didn't explain further. Eleanor didn't ask. That night she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the wind come off the mountains and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself since Boston. You are not here to be loved. You are here to survive. Survival is enough. She almost believed it. Monday arrived like a judgment. Eleanor came downstairs at 5:15 before Mrs. Calloway, before anyone, and started a fire in the kitchen stove, located the coffee, and had it ready by 5:28. She poured a cup, set it at the head of the table, and was seated at the far end with the ranch ledgers open in front of her, when Caleb walked in at precisely 5:30. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the coffee, looked at her, said nothing, sat down, drank. Eleanor had already found 3 accounting errors in the first ledger, one of them significant enough to represent nearly $40 in untracked expenditure, and she set the ledger on the table beside his coffee cup and pointed to the line without preamble. This entry on March 14th. The figure doesn't reconcile with the supply invoice from the same week. Someone recorded the delivery cost twice and missed the feed total entirely. You've been short $42 since spring. Caleb looked at the ledger, then at her. You found that in 20 minutes. I found that in 8, she said. The rest of the time I was looking for others. A pause. Something moved in his expression. Brief, controlled, quickly gone. Are there others? 6 more, smaller. I'll have a corrected record by afternoon. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down, and said without looking at her, Good. That was it. But Eleanor wrote in her notebook that evening, he said, Good. For Caleb Rourke, I suspect that is the equivalent of a standing ovation. The first real argument came on a Wednesday. Eleanor had gone into town, the small, wind-beaten settlement called Dural, 8 miles east, to retrieve a parcel of correspondence Caleb had been expecting from his attorney. She'd taken the smaller wagon herself, which Mrs. Calloway had told her was fine, which apparently was not what Caleb Rourke considered fine. When she returned, he was standing in the yard, not waiting, not worried, standing the way a man stands when he has decided to be angry about something and is simply choosing the moment to release it. I didn't authorize you to take the wagon alone, he said before she'd climbed down. You weren't available to ask, she said. And the parcel needed to be retrieved. You don't know this land. I followed the road, Mr. Rourke. It was quite straightforward. Roads ice over, horses spook, a woman alone on that stretch. A person alone on that stretch, Eleanor said, swinging down from the wagon and handing him the parcel squarely. Encounters whatever they encounter. I encountered nothing. Here is your correspondence. Would you like me to log it, or shall I simply leave it on your desk? He stared at her. She held his gaze. This was the thing about Caleb Rourke that Eleanor had noticed inside the first 48 hours. He was accustomed to people looking away from him. Not from cruelty, but from his weight. He had a quality that pressed against a room something still and heavy and certain that most people felt as a command to step back. He wasn't particularly loud. He wasn't given to dramatic gesture. He simply occupied a space in a way that made others conscious of their own smallness. Eleanor had spent 3 years being made conscious of her smallness by men who had far less reason to expect it. She did not step back. He took the parcel, turned away, then over his shoulder. "Next time, tell Mrs. Calloway where you're going." "I will," Eleanor said, "if you tell me why it matters." He stopped walking, didn't turn. His shoulders had that rigid quality again, that tension she was beginning to read like weather. "Because," he said finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of its sharpness, "this land doesn't care who you are, and I don't want—" He stopped, started again. "I'm responsible for what happens on my property." "I am not your property, Mr. Rourke." A long silence. "No," he said. "You're not." And he walked inside. Eleanor stood in the cold yard and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, the particular ache of a man almost saying something real and pulling back before it reached the air. She recognized it because she had spent years doing exactly the same thing. She picked up her bag, followed him inside. Weeks passed, then a month. The rhythm of the ranch settled into her like a second language, something she learned not from studying it, but from living inside it until it lived inside her. She learned the particular complaints of the cattle in cold mornings. She learned which of the ranch hands would come to her with questions they were afraid to bring to Caleb, and which ones watched her with the kind of suspicion that had nothing to do with her work and everything to do with her presence. She learned that Caleb Rourke ate alone when something was troubling him, and that he walked the fence line at dusk the way other men went to church methodically, quietly, like he was accounting for something. She learned that he read. This surprised her, though she could not have said why. Not newspapers, though he read those 2 novels. History, a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius that lived on his nightstand, though she only knew this because Mrs. Calloway mentioned it once and then looked as though she'd revealed a secret she hadn't meant to share. One evening late November, Eleanor was still at the study desk working through the month's correspondence when Caleb appeared in the doorway with a lantern and a look on his face that was almost uncertain. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm nearly finished." "It can wait until morning." "It cannot actually. The letter to your attorney about the water rights dispute needs to reach Billings before Friday, or the claim lapses. I've drafted 3 versions here." She turned the pages toward him. "The first is formal and airtight, but may read as aggressive to a judge. The second is measured, appeals to precedent. The third is shorter and bolder, and in my opinion the strongest, but I want your read before I decide." He crossed the room, stood beside her, read. She could feel him reading, the small shift in his breath, the stillness that came over him when he concentrated. He was close enough that she could see the worn edge of his collar, the callus on the hand that held the lantern. He smelled like cold air and wood smoke. "The third," he said. "I thought so too." "Why'd you write the other 2? "Because I wanted to show my reasoning," she said. "I don't expect anyone to simply trust my conclusions." A pause. He set the lantern on the corner of the desk. "You've been burned for being right before." It wasn't a question. She looked up at him. He was looking at the letters, not at her. "Yes," she said. "Boston." "Yes." He nodded slowly. Something in his jaw worked. "People are afraid of what they can't control," he said. "A woman who can outthink them that frightens men who've built their authority on the assumption that they're the only ones thinking." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's a surprisingly perceptive thing to say." "Don't sound so shocked." "I'm not shocked," she said. "I'm revising my assumptions. I thought you'd hired me for my accounting. I'm beginning to think you may have hired me for conversation." He looked at her then. directly fully for perhaps the first time since she'd arrived. His eyes were darker than she'd registered before, and not cold at all actually. Complicated. Like a man who has learned to hold a great deal inside a face that shows nothing. "Send the third letter," he said. "I will." He picked up the lantern, moved toward the door, stopped. Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her name. Just her name, no Miss Hart, no the woman, nothing formal or transactional. Just Eleanor, the way you say a word when you've been thinking it for a while. She didn't let herself react. "Yes. The ranch hands, two of them, have been giving you trouble. I've noticed." She had not mentioned it, had not planned to mention it. "It's nothing I can't handle." "I know you can handle it," he said. "I'm telling you I've noticed, and it's been addressed." She looked at him. "You didn't ask me what happened?" "I didn't need to. I watched." "You've been watching me." Something moved in his expression, brief, quickly gone. "It's my ranch," he said. "I watch everything on it." He left. Eleanor sat for a long time after the light from his lantern faded down the hallway. Then she opened her notebook and wrote for the first time since she'd arrived. Not an observation, but a question. What does it mean when a man says he watches everything, but the way he says it, the way his voice changes on the word? Everything makes you feel for the first time in 3 years like you are not invisible. She closed the notebook. Outside, the Montana wind came down hard off the mountains and pressed against the walls of Caleb Rourke's house, and Eleanor Hart sat in the lamplight and felt not safe, not settled, not certain, but something stranger than all of those. She felt seen. And for a woman who had spent 3 years being unseen by everyone who claimed to know her, that was the most dangerous thing in the world. The third letter worked. Caleb received word from Billings on a Thursday morning. The water rights claim had been acknowledged. The opposing party's lawyer had backed down from 2 of his 3 contested points, and the judge had agreed to a preliminary hearing in February that Caleb's attorney described as, in his exact words, far more favorable than anticipated. Caleb read the letter at the breakfast table, folded it once, and slid it across to Eleanor without a word. She read it, looked up. "The shorter argument," she said. "The shorter argument," he confirmed. Mrs. Calloway, who was refilling the coffee and pretending not to listen, made a small sound that might have been satisfaction and moved back to the stove. That was as close to celebration as the Rourke household got, and Eleanor found to her own mild surprise that it was enough. She had not come to Montana for celebrations. She had come because she'd had nowhere else to go, and the reasons behind that were still lodged in her chest like a splinter. Not always painful, but never entirely absent. What she had not expected was the particular satisfaction of work done well in a place that recognized it, not praised it, not rewarded it with warmth or gratitude or anything resembling emotion, but recognized it. Caleb Rourke acknowledged results the way a man acknowledges weather. It simply was. And somehow from him that carried more weight than compliments had from anyone in Boston. She told herself this was because she had lowered her expectations. She told herself this every day for the next 2 weeks with diminishing conviction. December came in hard. The temperature dropped in a single night. One of the ranch hands described it as the mountains exhaling, and the work on the property shifted entirely. Eleanor watched from the window as the men moved with that particular urgency that cold imposes, checking livestock, reinforcing shelter, hauling feed and water before the ground could freeze solid. She watched Caleb among them, not directing from a distance, but working alongside, his coat thrown open despite the temperature. Jaw-set hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times and intended to do it 100 more. She noticed he never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. She noticed this, wrote nothing about it, and went back to the ledgers. That evening, she found him in the study, which had begun to feel like shared territory, in a way neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them had contested. He was at his desk with maps spread out. Land surveys, property lines, something she didn't fully recognize. And he looked up when she came in, but didn't stop what he was doing. "I need to talk to you about the February supply order," she said, taking her usual chair. "Your feed costs are going to be 30% higher than last year if you use the same supplier. There's a merchant in Doral who can source the same quality for less, but he requires payment in advance, which means you'd need to move funds from the reserve account before—" "Do it," Caleb said. She paused. "I haven't told you the amount yet. Is it going to ruin me?" "No." "Then do it. I trust your numbers." She looked at him. He was still studying the maps, a pencil, moving across one margin. "You trust my numbers," she repeated. "That surprises you." "It would surprise most people who know me." He set down the pencil, leaned back, looked at her with that full, direct quality she had come to recognize as his version of paying attention. "Who were the people who knew you in Boston?" he asked. "School board members, parents, a reverend who found my teaching methods threatening to his authority." She kept her voice even. The usual collection of men who confused their discomfort with moral conviction. "What did they say you did wrong?" "I taught the girls the same curriculum as the boys," Eleanor said. "Mathematics rhetoric, basic legal terminology. I thought if a woman understood contracts, she could protect herself. I thought if she understood argument, she could make one." She paused. "The reverend called it dangerous. The board called it inappropriate. The parents called it a lot of things. What they did was have me removed." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. His face gave nothing away, but she had learned to read the quality of his silence, and this one had weight in it. And then 3 years of various forms of invisibility, she said, "until your letter." He looked at the maps, back at her. "I didn't send that letter to do you a kindness." "I know. I sent it because I needed someone capable, and I knew what society does with capable women. It discards them, which made them available to me." Eleanor tilted her head. "That is the most cynically honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years. I appreciate it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, the barest structural shift there and gone. "You're a strange woman, Eleanor Hart. I've been told. I mean it as a compliment." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't correct you." The not smile came back slightly more defined this time. He picked up his pencil. "Move the funds. Get the better supplier." "Yes, sir," she said, and something in her own tone surprised her, because it wasn't obedience exactly. It was the sound of two people who have found against all reasonable expectation a language they can both speak. It was Mrs. Calloway who told her about Margaret. Not directly, Mrs. Calloway was not a direct woman about anything that mattered. She came at important things sideways the way you approach a horse that's been spooked, and Eleanor had learned to pay attention when she did. It happened in the kitchen mid-December while Eleanor was helping dry the supper dishes, a task she'd taken on, not because anyone asked, but because standing still in the evenings had begun to feel wrong, and Mrs. Calloway's kitchen was warm in a way the rest of the house wasn't. "He had a wife," Mrs. Calloway said her back to Eleanor, her hands still in the wash basin. "Before." Eleanor kept drying. "I assumed as much. Her name was Margaret. She was from Billings. Pretty girl, good family." A pause. "She didn't take to the ranch. The isolation, the winters. She wanted society music people. Caleb, he thought love would be enough, that she'd learn to love the land the way he did." Another pause longer. She didn't. "How long ago?" "She left 4 years back. Not a divorce, she just went. Took what she came with and went back to Billings and wrote him a letter from there explaining that she had never wanted this life and had never been honest with him about that, and she was sorry." Mrs. Calloway dried her hands. "He read that letter once and burned it. Hasn't spoken her name since." Eleanor set down the dish, picked up another. "And the child?" she asked, because she had done the arithmetic the contract mentioned securing his inheritance, and she had wondered. There wasn't one. She was gone before... Mrs. Calloway stopped. Before. Eleanor didn't say anything. "He's not cold because he was born that way," Mrs. Calloway said, and the directness of it after all the careful sideways approach made Eleanor look up. The older woman met her eyes. "He's cold because being warm cost him everything once, and he doesn't trust himself to survive it again." Eleanor looked down at the dish in her hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "I'm not telling you to fix him," the woman said immediately. "I'm too old to believe in that kind of foolishness. I'm only telling you so you understand what you're dealing with. There's a difference." "I know there is," Eleanor said. "I've been trying to fix people's opinion of me for 3 years. It doesn't work." Mrs. Calloway made that small, satisfied sound again. "No, it doesn't." Eleanor put the dish away, went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed and opened the notebook and held the pen over the page for a long time without writing anything. What was there to write that she understood him better now? That understanding someone was not the same as knowing what to do with the understanding. She wrote, "He built walls because the last person inside them walked out, and now I am inside them, not because he invited me, not because he chose me in any way that resembles choice, but because we both signed a piece of paper and called it practicality. I wonder sometimes which of us is running from more." She closed the notebook. Outside, the wind was working at the corners of the house. Christmas on the ranch was not a celebration. It was simply December 25th with better food. Mrs. Calloway cooked, the ranch hands ate. Caleb sat at the head of the table and participated in conversation exactly as much as he always did, which was precisely enough and not a syllable more. Eleanor sat at the other end and watched the men tell stories about other winters and other ranches and cattle that had done remarkable or disastrous things. And she thought about Christmas in Boston, which had been full of warmth and noise and community, all of which had been stripped from her so efficiently that she could barely remember what belonging to a group of people felt like. After supper, when the hands had gone and Mrs. Calloway had retired and the house had settled into its familiar nighttime silence, Caleb appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where Eleanor was reading. He was holding something. She looked up. It was a book. He crossed the room and set it on the table beside her chair without ceremony. She picked it up. It was a copy of Middlemarch, not new, but clean, carefully kept, the spine uncracked. "You mentioned Elliot," he said. "In the letter you wrote when you replied to the advertisement. You mentioned her in the context of women's education." Eleanor looked at him. "You remembered that." "I remember everything I read." "You kept my letter." A pause. Something moved in his expression, something she didn't quite have a name for yet, something careful and exposed at the same time. "I keep all correspondence," he said. "Of course," she said. She looked at the book, ran her thumb along the spine. "Thank you, Caleb." His name, just his name, the way he had used hers that night in the study. Not formal, not careful, just the word itself placed between them, like something real. He didn't move for a moment. Then he gave a short nod, turned and went back to his study. She heard the door close quietly. Not a retreat exactly. Something more like a man who has done a thing he's not certain about and needs a moment alone with the consequence of it. Eleanor held the book in both hands and told herself very firmly that it was a practical gesture. A man maintaining a productive working relationship with someone useful to him. Nothing more. She told herself this several times. It worked about as well as it usually did. Kong. The argument in January was different from the one about the wagon. That one had been about authority, Caleb's instinct to protect his domain, Eleanor's refusal to shrink inside it. This one went deeper. This one drew blood. It started with a letter that arrived from Boston. She didn't know how anyone had found her address. She had told no one where she'd gone, had written to no one, had deliberately placed herself outside the reach of every person who had participated in her unmaking. But someone had found it, and the letter came in a plain envelope with a return address she recognized as belonging to the school board, and the message inside was short and contemptuous, and clearly written by someone who believed their contempt was righteousness. Miss Hart, it has come to our attention that you have entered into an arrangement in Montana that confirms every concern we raised regarding your character and moral unsuitability for the shaping of young minds. We do not write to persuade or reprove. We write only so that you know we know. Your choices speak plainly enough. She read it at the kitchen table alone, before anyone else was up. Then she folded it and sat with it in her hands and breathed through the particular shame of it. Not because they were right, but because shame doesn't require being right. It only requires the right voice saying the right condemnation at the right moment of vulnerability, and these men had spent years calibrating exactly that. Caleb found her there. He didn't say anything at first, just poured his coffee, sat down, registered the letter in her hands, and the quality of her stillness. "Bad news," he said. "Old news," she said. "Delivered late." He waited. She put the letter on the table. He looked at it, then at her. She nodded, and he picked it up and read it. His face did that thing she had come to recognize, the controlled stillness that was not absence of feeling, but the very careful management of it. He set it down. "Who sent this?" "The school board that removed me." "Why?" "Because small men have long memories and access to postal services," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "They want me to know that my choices are visible to them, that I remain—" She stopped, chose the word deliberately. "Legible, to their judgment." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do with it?" She looked up. "What issue? The letter. What do you want to do with it?" Nobody had asked her that. In 3 years of being the subject of other people's decisions, not one person had asked what she wanted to do. She stared at him across the table and felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief, exactly, not relief. Something that had been waiting for so long without a door that it had forgotten what opening felt like. "Burn it," she said. He stood up, took the letter, walked to the stove, opened the grate, and held it to the flame until it caught. He held it until the last of it was ash. Then he closed the grate and came back to the table and refilled her coffee and sat back down. "Done," he said. Eleanor looked at the stove, looked at her coffee, looked at Caleb Rourke, who had just destroyed a piece of her past without drama or declaration or any expectation of gratitude, and she felt for the first time since the day she'd walked away from that schoolhouse like something had been returned to her. Not everything, not even most things, but something real, something she hadn't known she'd needed someone to help her carry. "You didn't ask what was in it," she said, "beyond what you read." "I read enough." "You didn't ask if they were right." He met her eyes. "I didn't need to." "Why not?" He picked up his coffee, set it down, looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her, and said the most direct thing he had said to her since the day she arrived. "Because I watch you work. Every day. I watch how your mind moves and how you treat people and what you do when you think nobody's looking. And what I see—" He stopped. The words seemed to cost him something. "What I see doesn't match what they say. So they're wrong. It's simple arithmetic." Eleanor was quiet. Outside, the January wind pressed against the glass. "Simple arithmetic," she said finally. "You like numbers," he said. "So do I." And she laughed a real laugh, unexpected, rising up from somewhere that hadn't laughed in a very long time. And Caleb Rourke looked at her when she laughed, with an expression she couldn't quite read, something open and alarmed, and very carefully, very deliberately set aside. But she had seen it. And the thing about Eleanor Hart was that she remembered everything she saw. The laugh stayed with her longer than she expected. Not the sound of it, though she replayed that too, in the quiet moments before sleep, with a mixture of warmth and suspicion, directed entirely at herself, but the look on his face when it happened. That open, alarmed quality quickly shuddered. The expression of a man who has been caught wanting something he has not given himself permission to want. She had seen that expression before in the mirror approximately every day for the past 3 years, and she recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting on someone else's page. She did not mention it. Neither did he. They returned to their routine with the particular care of two people who have agreed without speaking to leave something where it fell and walk around it rather than pick it up. But the distance between them had shifted. Not closed, not yet, but changed in character. The silences at supper were no longer empty. The evenings in the study when they both happened to be working had a different quality, something that was not quite comfort, but was no longer wariness either. He handed her things without thinking about it, the salt at the table, a document he wanted her opinion on the lantern when she was reaching for it. She stopped announcing her movements around the house. She simply moved, and he simply noted it, and neither of them said a word about what that meant. Mrs. Calloway, who missed nothing, said nothing either. She simply started making enough coffee for two without being asked. February arrived with the water rights hearing, and Eleanor prepared Caleb for it, the way she imagined a second prepared a duelist, methodically, thoroughly, without false reassurance. She drafted his statement, cross-referenced it against the opposing party's known claims, anticipated 3 likely counter-arguments, and wrote responses to each. She sat across from him at the desk for 4 evenings in a row, and walked him through every point until he could argue it in his sleep. He was a quick study. She had suspected this but confirmed it fully during those evenings. Caleb Rourke's stillness was not passivity. It was concentration. When he was engaged with a problem, he was entirely engaged, every part of him directed at it, and the quality of his attention was the kind that made the person on the receiving end feel that what they were saying mattered absolutely. She had not felt that in a very long time. On the 3rd evening, somewhere past 9 o'clock, he looked up from the draft she'd prepared and said, "You should have been a lawyer." "Women cannot be lawyers," she said. "That's not what I said." She looked at him. "I said you should have been one," he said. "Not that you could be. There's a difference worth keeping." She was quiet for a moment. Most people don't make that distinction. Most people aren't paying attention. He set down the draft, leaned back. "When this water rights business is resolved, I want you to look at the property deed for the north parcel. There's a boundary dispute that's been sitting for 2 years because I haven't had anyone I trusted to read the language carefully." "I'll look at it," she said. "And the grazing contracts, 3 of them, need renegotiation in spring. They're written in favor of the other party, and I've been losing ground on them since my father's time." "Caleb," he stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, directly, the way she said things when she meant them completely. "You don't have to line up the work to justify my being here." Something shifted in his face. That exposed quality again, less quickly hidden this time. "I know that," he said. "Do you?" A long pause. He looked at the papers on the desk, then at her. "Old habit," he said finally, "making sure things are secured." "I'm not a fence post." "No," he said. "You're considerably more opinionated than a fence post. And better at arithmetic." That almost smile again. "Marginally." She gathered the papers. "Get some sleep. The hearing's in 4 days and you need to be sharp, not tired. You sound like a general." "I've been told I have the disposition for it." She stood, tucking the draft under her arm. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eleanor." She heard her name in his voice all the way up the stairs. He won the hearing. Not completely. The judge split the determination, granting Caleb the primary water access he needed while leaving one tributary point unresolved for a later term. His attorney wrote that it was the best possible outcome given the opposition's influence in Billings. Caleb read the letter at breakfast, and this time when he slid it across to Eleanor, she read it and looked up and said, "Well done." And he said, "We," and that single word sat between them for the rest of the meal, like something neither of them was ready to examine too closely. March came. The snow was still heavy, but the character of it changed. The cold, lost its killing edge. The light came back a little earlier each day, and the ranch began its slow return to motion. More work, more men on the property, more noise. Eleanor found herself missing the closed quiet of the deep winter months and did not particularly want to think about why. She had begun to sleep poorly, not from worry, or not exactly. More from an excess of thought that wouldn't quiet itself when she lay down, that turned over the same questions in the dark without arriving at answers. She knew what the questions were about. She was not a woman who evaded the contents of her own mind. She simply had not yet decided what to do with what she knew, because what she knew was inconvenient and complicated and directly in conflict with the terms of the arrangement she had signed her name to in December. She was developing feelings for Caleb Rourke, not the soft romantic feelings she had read about in novels and largely dismissed as the invention of writers who had never been responsible for their own survival. Harder feelings than that. The kind that come from watching someone work and finding you respect them. From arguing with someone and finding they can hold their ground without cruelty. From sitting in silence with someone and finding the silence says something. From being seen accurately completely without flinching and finding it doesn't destroy you. She wrote in her notebook, "I am in trouble. Not the kind I know how to solve with arithmetic." The storm came without sufficient warning. The ranch hands had tracked weather well enough all winter, reading the sky and the animal behavior with the practiced fluency of men whose lives depended on it. But this one moved faster than anyone expected. It came down from the northwest in the early afternoon of a Tuesday in late March, when the season should have been softening, when the worst should have been behind them, and by the time the full weight of it arrived, it had already made certain decisions on everyone's behalf. Eleanor was in the study when the temperature dropped. She noticed the change in the quality of the light first, then the sound of the wind shifting from its usual register to something lower and more serious. And she went to find Mrs. Calloway, who was already pulling extra wood inside, and had the expression of a woman who had weathered 40 Montana winters and recognized this one's intentions. "How bad?" Eleanor asked. "Bad enough," Mrs. Calloway said. "Stay inside." "Where's Caleb?" The older woman's hands stilled for just a moment. "He went to check the north fence line this morning. Said he'd be back by noon." It was past 2. Eleanor went to the window. The snow was moving almost horizontally now, the kind of visibility that turned familiar land into abstraction. She stood there for 3 minutes. Then she went to the coat rack, pulled on her heaviest coat, her gloves, her hat, wound a scarf twice around her neck. "Miss Hart." Mrs. Calloway's voice was sharp. "He knows the land," Eleanor said. "But he's been gone 4 hours. The hands will go. The hands are securing the livestock. They can't leave the cattle in this." She was already at the door. "Which direction is the north fence?" "Eleanor." Mrs. Calloway used her name, which she rarely did, and the weight of it was enough to make Eleanor turn. The older woman looked at her with an expression that was equal parts fear and something else, something that recognized exactly what was happening and had perhaps seen it coming longer than Eleanor had. "Take the rope from the hook beside the barn door. Tie one end to the post and keep it in your hand. Don't let go of it under any circumstances." "I know," Eleanor said. "He'd want you to stay inside." "I know that too," Eleanor said. "Tell me which direction." She found him by the sound of it. Or rather, she found the absence the place where the fence line should have continued, and didn't the gap in the snow-weighted posts that indicated something had broken through. She followed the line of disturbance in the snow, the rope in her left hand going taut behind her, the wind pressing against her face hard enough to make her eyes water and her breath come in short, controlled pulls. She almost missed the ravine entirely. It wasn't deep, not the kind of drop that kills outright, but it was hidden, the edge obscured by snowdrift, and it angled sharply enough that anyone going through the fence at speed would have no time to stop. She heard him before she saw him. A sound short-controlled, the kind of sound a man makes when he's been hurt, and is managing it deliberately and hasn't yet decided to call for help. She dropped to her knees at the edge and looked down. Caleb was approximately 8 feet below her, wedged at the base of the ravine's inner wall, one leg at an angle that was wrong enough to tell her immediately what had happened. He'd hit the slope and gone down hard and rolled, and something in the landing had done damage. He was upright, sitting braced, which meant he was conscious, which was the only thing that mattered right now. "Caleb." He looked up. In the dim white chaos of the storm, his face was very pale, set into lines of controlled pain, and something that was not she noticed relief at being found. It was something more complicated than relief. "Go back," he said. "I'm not going back." "Eleanor." "I have a rope," she said. "Can you stand?" "My leg." "Can you stand on one leg and use your arms?" A pause. His jaw tightened. "Yes." "Then here." She fed the rope over the edge, controlling the slack. "Tie it under your arms. Not your hands, you'll need your hands to push off the wall. The storm is getting worse." "I'm aware. Tie the rope." "You can't pull me up alone, the angle." "Caleb." Her voice cut through the wind, through the pain in his face, through every instinct he had toward self-sufficiency and away from being helped. "Tie the rope." He tied the rope. It took longer than either of them wanted, and cost him something in the doing. She could see the effort in every movement, the careful management of a body that was past the point of managing comfortably. But he got it done, and she braced herself at the ravine's edge, both feet planted against a fence post that was still solid, and she pulled. He helped. That was the thing, despite the leg, despite the angle, despite the cold that had been sitting on him for however long he'd been down there. He pressed himself up the wall with everything he had and didn't make a sound doing it. And Eleanor pulled against his weight with everything she had and didn't let go. Her shoulders burned. Her hands, even through the gloves, ached with the strain of it. The wind pushed at her like it had opinions about the outcome. She did not let go. When his hand came over the edge, she grabbed his wrist with both of hers and held, and he got his good leg under him and came up and over, and they both went down hard in the snow at the ravine's lip, her on her back, him half across her, both of them breathing like they'd run a mile uphill. For a moment, neither of them moved. The snow fell on them with complete indifference to what had just happened. Then Caleb pushed himself up on one arm and looked down at her, and his face was very close and very pale, and carrying an expression she had no category for, something broken. Open, something stripped of every careful management he deployed against the world, and he said, his voice low and unsteady, in a way she had never heard it. "I told you to go back." "I know," she said. "You could have been hurt." "So could you. You were hurt." "That's different." "It isn't," she said. "Not to me." He stared at her. The storm pressed around them. Snow on his hat, on her scarf, on the space between their faces that was less than it had ever been. She could see him trying to reconstruct his composure, and not quite getting there, the walls coming up, and finding they didn't fit the same way anymore, like a house that's shifted on its foundation and can't be made square again. "Eleanor," her name in his voice, raw this time, no management around it at all. "Why did you come out here?" "Because you were gone too long." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now," she said. "Can we have this conversation somewhere that isn't a blizzard?" Something moved through his expression, something that started like a bitter laugh and arrived somewhere entirely different. He got his arm under her and helped her up, and she got her arm around him, and they stood together leaning into each other against the weight of the wind and began the slow, difficult work of getting back. She kept the rope in her hand the whole way. He kept his arm around her the whole way. Neither of them spoke. The house came out of the white, gradually materializing from the storm, like something they'd earned. Mrs. Calloway met them at the door and made the particular sound of a woman who has been afraid for 2 hours and is expressing the relief of it as business. She had hot water-ready bandages, the particular authority of someone who has dealt with worse than this and knows exactly what to do. She took charge of Caleb's leg with efficiency and no ceremony, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway with melting snow in her hair and her hands still faintly trembling from the rope and watched. Sit down before you fall down, Mrs. Calloway said without looking up from Caleb's leg. Eleanor sat. Caleb was watching her from across the kitchen. He had been watching her since they came through the door with that stripped open would never have allowed on his face in a room with another person. The leg was bad, a deep bruise, possibly a minor fracture at the ankle, nothing that wouldn't heal, but nothing that didn't hurt, and he was enduring Mrs. Calloway's treatment with his usual controlled stillness. But his eyes were on Eleanor, and they were saying something his mouth hadn't found words for yet. "You're going to have to stay off it for at least 2 weeks," Mrs. Calloway said. "A week?" Caleb said. "2? The spring work." "We'll wait," Eleanor said from across the room. He looked at her. "It will wait," she said again quietly, firmly, in the voice she used when she meant something completely. "I'll manage the correspondence. The hands know the early spring work. 2 weeks isn't going to break anything that isn't already broken." A long silence. "Fine," he said. Mrs. Calloway made her satisfied sound. Eleanor looked at the table in front of her. She became aware that her hands were still shaking, not from cold now or exertion, but from the delayed arrival of what had happened out there, what it had cost her, what the 8 feet of empty space below the ravine's edge and the sound of his voice in the dark had done to the careful distance she had been maintaining between what she felt and what she was willing to admit she felt. She pressed her palms flat on the table. Caleb said her name, quiet, direct across the kitchen. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, just that. 2 words, no management around them, nothing formal or transactional. Just the words and his voice and the way he was looking at her like she was something he had not known he needed and had found anyway. She nodded, didn't trust her voice quite yet. Outside, the storm had made its decision about the night. Inside, something else entirely had made its own. He stayed off the leg for 2 weeks. This was not, Eleanor quickly discovered, the same as staying still. Caleb Rourke confined to the house was Caleb Rourke redistributed, rather than reduced. He moved from the study to the kitchen to the front room, with the particular restlessness of a man whose relationship with his own body had always been defined by what it could do, and now couldn't and wasn't handling the difference gracefully. He read. He reviewed documents. He summoned the ranch hands one at a time to give instruction and receive reports, which he did from the chair by the study window, with his leg extended and his jaw set at the precise angle of a man who wants very badly to be somewhere else, and has decided that wanting this is unacceptable. Eleanor managed him the way she managed everything, directly, without apology, with the particular efficiency of someone who has identified the problem and sees no reason to discuss it at length. She brought him the ledgers. She brought him the grazing contracts he'd mentioned in February. She sat across from him while he read and answered his questions when he had them, and asked her own when she didn't understand something about the land agreements. And he explained with the patience of a man who finds explaining things to someone genuinely interested in learning them to be a different experience than explaining things to someone who is simply waiting for him to stop talking. They worked. All day. Some days. The house was quiet around them, and the early spring light came through the window, and Mrs. Calloway left food at the study door, and occasionally appeared in person to make sure they had both eaten, which they sometimes forgot. On the 4th day of his confinement, Caleb looked up from the document he was reading and said without preamble, "Tell me about your father." Eleanor looked up from the ledger. "Why?" "Because I've told you something about mine," he said. Which was true. He had mentioned his father once briefly in the context of the grazing contracts being written disadvantageously since his father's time. But she had heard the weight behind the brevity. "And I've been in this house for 4 months, and I don't know who made you." She set down her pen, considered. "My father was a school teacher," she said, "which is where I got it from. He believed very seriously that education was the only inheritance worth leaving. He taught my brothers and me the same curriculum without distinction. Mathematics, literature, logic, argument." She paused. "He died when I was 19. After that, my brothers went to university. I went to work." "And your mother?" "My mother believed my father was right about everything. she said, except the part that applied to me. She thought a woman's education was for the benefit of her household, not herself. We disagreed about this for the rest of her life. Respectfully. Mostly. She was not a cruel woman. She simply could not imagine a world different from the one she had lived in, and she thought imagining such things was dangerous. Eleanor looked at her hands. She died 3 years before I came here, the year I lost the school position. I used to think if she'd lived to see that she would have said she'd warned me. Now I think she would have been angrier on my behalf than I was. Caleb was quiet. People surprise you, he said, when you give them the chance to respond to something real. Is that experience talking? A pause. Margaret, he said. The name sat between them the first time she had heard it from his own mouth. He said it the way you say the name of a wound you've been carrying long enough that it's become part of your architecture. I thought she was one thing. She thought she was another. We were both performing for each other, and neither of us was honest enough or brave enough to stop until there was nothing left to perform for. You blame yourself, Eleanor said. I blame us both, in equal measure. He looked at the window. She wanted a different life than the one I had. I wanted her to want mine. Neither of us asked the right questions before it was too late to ask them without the answers costing everything. What would the right questions have been? He turned back to her. What are you afraid of? He said. And what are you willing to lose for what you love? The room was very quiet. Those are good questions, Eleanor said. They're the only questions, he said. Everything else is paperwork. She held his gaze. What are you afraid of? She asked, just like that. Quietly, directly, the way she asked everything. His jaw moved. Something in him contracted and then deliberately released. Choosing wrong again, he said. Believing I know someone and finding out I've only known the version they were willing to show me. And what would it take, she said, for you to believe you weren't choosing wrong? He looked at her for a long time. Time, he said, and someone who doesn't change their answers based on who's asking. I have never done that in my life, Eleanor said. It is, in fact, the primary reason I lost my position, my standing, and every social connection I had in Boston. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you. She picked up her pen, went back to the ledger. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not, but she had spent a long time keeping those two things separate. The first night it happened was also the last night either of them pretended it wasn't going to. It was 10 days into his confinement, the house dark except for the study lamp. Mrs. Calloway long since retired. The wind outside, doing what wind in Montana does in early April. Pressing at everything, testing what holds. Eleanor had fallen asleep in the chair across from his desk, which she knew, because she woke up there stiff-necked, the ledger still open on her lap, the lamp burning low. Caleb was watching her. Not the way a man watches something that has surprised him. The way a man watches something he has been watching for a long time and has finally stopped pretending he isn't. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The lamp made small sounds. The wind made large ones. The house held them both in its particular silence. You should have woken me, she said. You needed sleep, he said. You've been up before 5 every morning for 2 weeks. So have you. I don't sleep well regardless. Neither do I, she said. Lately. Something in the word lately carried more than she'd intended, and they both heard it, and neither of them looked away. She set the ledger on the table beside her. He leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on her face, and the careful, managed distance that had characterized every interaction between them since December was simply gone. Not gradually, not through negotiation. Just gone the way a thing goes when it's been held in place by effort alone, and the effort finally runs out. Eleanor, he said. Don't, she said. Not sharply, gently. Don't say anything that you're going to manage tomorrow." A long silence. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Anymore. Whatever this is. I used to know I thought I knew, and then I got it wrong badly enough that I wrote a contract instead of trying again. Because a contract has terms. Terms can be met. Terms don't—" He stopped. "Terms don't leave." "I'm not Margaret," she said. "I know that. I mean, I am not a woman who leaves because the life is hard." She said, "I have been in hard lives. I left Boston with nothing and signed my name to an arrangement that most women I knew would have called beneath them, and I did it because I am capable of choosing survival over comfort when I have to. What I cannot do, what I have never been able to do, is perform a version of myself that other people find easier to manage." She held his gaze. "What you see is what is here. Every day. Without adjustment." He looked at her. That open, exposed quality on his face, not fighting it anymore. "I know that too," he said quietly. "I've known it since the second week. Maybe sooner." "Then what are you afraid of?" she said. The same question again, different context, same sincerity. "That I'll ask you to stay," he said. "And the terms will change, and you'll find out I'm not." He stopped, chose the words carefully. "That what I can give isn't enough. Caleb." Her voice was very quiet. A man who burns a stranger's letter, who remembers a passing reference to a novelist, who watches someone be mistreated by his ranch hands and corrects it without being asked, that man is not someone with nothing to give. She paused. He is someone who has been so afraid of giving again that he wrote a contract to make the giving feel safe. He was very still. "The contract was never really about terms," she said. "Was it?" A long moment. Then, "No," he said, very low. "It wasn't." She stood up, crossed the room, stood in front of him, and he looked up at her, and she put her hand against the side of his face. Just her hand. Just that. And felt the tension in his jaw, and the warmth of his skin, and the way he closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, like a man who has been standing in the cold for a very long time and has finally stepped somewhere warmer. Then she stepped back. "Get some sleep," she said. "Your leg is still healing." He opened his eyes, looked at her with that expression she had no category for and had stopped trying to categorize. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes. I'm asking you to stay." The words came out plain and clear and unmanaged, nothing around them, just the request itself, bare and real. Not because of the contract. Not because of the ledgers or the letters or any of it. "I'm asking you because—" He stopped, found it. "Because this house is a different place with you in it, and I don't want to know what it goes back to without you." She stood in the doorway of his study with the lamp burning low behind him, and the Montana night pressing at the windows, and she felt something settle in her chest, not the dramatic earthquake of a feeling she'd been bracing against, but something quieter and more permanent, the way a bone heals, the way a foundation is laid slow and solid and done. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She had said it before. This time, it meant something different. The 2 weeks ended. He got back on the leg carefully under Eleanor's supervision, which he submitted to with better grace than she'd expected, and more argument than was strictly necessary, which she had in fact expected entirely. What changed between them after that night in the study was not loud or dramatic or visible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Mrs. Calloway was paying close attention. She said nothing except to make coffee for two without being asked, as she had been doing for months, which Eleanor now understood had been less observation and more faith. What changed was smaller than an announcement and larger than anything that could be contained in a contract. He touched her hand when he passed her something at the table. She leaned her shoulder against his arm when they stood at the study window, looking out at the spring-softened land, talking about the water rights decision, or the grazing contracts, or the north pasture fence that still needed proper repair, and the conversation was about all those things, and also not about them at all. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the almost smile she had spent months cataloging, but a real sound startled out of him once by something she said about the feed supplier, and once more when a calf in the yard did something undignified. And each time it happened, she felt it like something returned to the world that had been missing from it. She stopped writing observations in her notebook. She wasn't sure exactly when. She noticed the absence one evening and sat with the closed notebook in her hands and realized she had stopped because she no longer felt the need to record him from a careful distance. She was no longer gathering evidence. She was simply living alongside him. And that was a thing so different from what she'd arrived here expecting to do, that she held it gently, the way you hold something you're not yet sure belongs to you. The argument when it came was not about the water rights or the contracts or anything practical. It came on a Thursday in late April, without warning, the way the worst arguments come out of something that seemed small and revealed itself to be large. A letter arrived from Caleb's attorney in Billings. Eleanor collected the mail as she always did, sorted it, set the correspondence in its appropriate place, and was about to set Caleb's personal correspondence on his desk when she saw the name on the outer envelope, not the attorney's name, but a second enclosure inside, forwarded through the attorney's office. Margaret Rourke. She set it on his desk without opening it, without comment, and went to find him in the yard, told him there was correspondence, went back inside, went about her morning. She did not ask. It was not her letter. It was not her business. But Caleb came in from the yard an hour later with that letter in his hand and a look on his face that was not the open, careful expression she had come to know. It was older than that, harder, the face of the man who had burned her Boston letter in the kitchen stove 4 months ago, before she had learned to read him clearly enough to know what the stillness was hiding. He sat down at the kitchen table. Didn't speak. Eleanor poured coffee, set it in front of him, sat across from him. "She's in Sacramento," he said finally. "Remarried. Has a child." He set the letter flat on the table. "She wrote to say she hopes I've found—" He stopped, read the line again. "She hopes I've found some measure of peace." "Is it genuine?" Eleanor asked. "I think so." He looked at the letter. "That's the strange part. I think she actually means it. She wasn't a cruel woman, Margaret. She was just wrong for this. Wrong for me. Or I was wrong for her. The distinction matters less than it used to." "How does it feel?" Eleanor asked, hearing from her. He was quiet for a long time. "Like closing a door that's been standing open for 4 years, he said. "Not painful exactly. More like finished. Like something I didn't know was still unresolved has resolved." Eleanor nodded, said nothing. He folded the letter, set it aside, looked at her across the table. "I'm not going to burn this one," he said. "I didn't ask you to." "I know. I'm telling you because—" He stopped. "Because I don't want there to be things I'm managing around you. Not anymore." "There don't have to be," she said. "She asked for what she needed," he said. "Margaret. Eventually. Too late, but she asked. I didn't. I held on to what I wanted the life to be and expected the rest to arrange itself." His jaw worked. "I'm telling you this because I have been sitting here for an hour thinking about what I would do if you decided you wanted something different from this. From me." He looked at her directly. "And I realized I would ask you, not hold on and wait and hope. I would ask you what you needed, and I would try to give it to you. Because that's the thing I didn't know how to do before, and I need you to know I'm learning it." Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen table in the morning light, with his coffee cooling beside the folded letter, from a woman who had once been his whole life and had left, and she felt something so full it almost frightened her. Not almost, but entirely briefly, the way things that matter frighten you, not because they're dangerous, but because losing them would be. "I need very little," she said. "I have spent enough of my life proving I can survive on nothing. What I need," she stopped, found it, "is to be seen accurately. Not kindly, not carefully, accurately. The way you saw me from the second week before either of us was willing to say so. I can do that, he said. No hesitation, no management around it. I know, she said. You already have been. He reached across the table, put his hand over hers, large and warm and certain, in the way his hands were certain about everything they touched. She turned her palm up and held his hand, and they sat like that in the morning kitchen, with the spring light coming through the windows and the sound of the ranch waking up around them. And it was not romantic in the way stories made romance. It was better than that. It was real. It was two people both damaged by the particular cruelties that life reserves for those who want too much or feel too deeply or refuse stubbornly to be reduced to something manageable. Two people choosing with full knowledge of the cost to stay. Neither of them said it out loud. They didn't need to. Outside somewhere on the newly green north pasture, a calf called out and was answered. Spring settled over the ranch the way it always did in Montana, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments with the cold, winning a little ground each day, until one morning you stepped outside and realized the cold had conceded the season without anyone marking the exact moment of surrender. Eleanor marked it anyway. She marked most things. What she did not mark, because some things resist being recorded, resist being held at the distance that a notebook requires, was the precise morning she stopped thinking of herself as a woman who had arrived at Caleb Rourke's ranch and started thinking of herself as a woman who lived there. It happened somewhere between the letter from Margaret and the first genuinely warm afternoon in May, when she walked the fence line of the east pasture with Caleb beside her, and the new grass was coming in green, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that Montana produces in spring, like a rebuttal to everything winter said, and she felt with a completeness that startled her that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not say this. She was still Eleanor Hart, and Eleanor Hart did not make declarations about belonging to places or people without being certain the feeling would hold. But she thought it and held it quietly, and it held. Caleb walked beside her without touching her, which had become its own language between them, the particular restraint of two people who have agreed to something without signing anything new, who understand that what exists between them now is more binding than any contract, and requires more care precisely because it cannot be dissolved with a letter from an attorney. He pointed out where the fence needed work. She noted which sections she'd already flagged in the property survey she'd completed the week before. They moved together through the morning with the ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough to inhabit the same space without negotiating it. "The north parcel," he said as they turned back toward the house. "What about it? I want to put your name on the deed." She stopped walking. He stopped too, turned to look at her. His face was doing that thing, the careful, stripped-down honesty that she had come to understand was his version of courage. It cost him something, that look. She knew it now, the way she knew the cost of her own particular braveries. "That's not necessary," she said. "I know it's not necessary," he said. "That's not why I want to do it." "Caleb, you've been managing this property for 5 months," he said. "The water rights decision, the grazing contracts, the supply costs, the legal correspondence, things that were bleeding this ranch for years before you got here, are resolved because of how your mind works. That's not sentiment. That's fact." He held her gaze. "But it's also not the reason. The reason is that I want you to have something that's yours. Not because of a contract. Not because you earned it. Because this land knows you now, and you ought to know it back the same way." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the new grass around them. "You're not asking me," she said. "No," he said. "I'm telling you. You can argue if you want." "I almost always want to," she said. "I know." Something in his expression shifted that almost smile long past the point of almost now fully present, fully his. "Do you?" She looked out at the land. At the fence line they'd just walked, the mountains still white at their peaks against the spring blue sky, the smoke from the house chimney rising straight up in the still morning air. She thought about Boston, about a schoolroom she had loved and lost, About a desk in a boarding house where she'd read a letter that offered her nothing romantic and everything practical, and had said yes because yes was the only direction left. "No," she said. "I don't argue." He nodded. Turned back toward the house. She fell into step beside him, and his hand found hers without ceremony, without announcement, the way it had been doing since April, simply and completely, and as if it had always known the way there. They married in June. Not in a church. Caleb had no particular relationship with the church in Dural, and Eleanor had spent enough time being judged by men with Bibles that she had no appetite for ceremony conducted under their authority. They married in the yard of the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, with Mrs. Calloway as witness, and a circuit judge who owed Caleb a professional courtesy, and asked no unnecessary questions. The vows were standard. The words were words. What was real was the moment after, when the judge had gone, and Mrs. Calloway had disappeared into the kitchen with the particular discretion of a woman who understands the architecture of private moments, and Caleb and Eleanor stood in the yard in the June afternoon and looked at each other. "Well," Eleanor said. "Well," he said. That was considerably less complicated than the water rights hearing. He laughed. That real laugh, the one she had learned to love the way you love something irreplaceable, knowing exactly what it would cost to lose it, choosing to love it anyway. "Higher stakes," he said. "Infinitely," she agreed. He tucked a piece of hair back from her face, his thumb resting for a moment against her cheek, and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the night in the study after the storm, like she was something he had not known how to hope for, and had found anyway, and intended to spend the rest of his life being accurate about. "Eleanor Rourke," he said, trying out the name. "I may keep Hart professionally," she said, "for the legal correspondence." "Of course you will," he said. "I have a reputation in Billings now." "You have a reputation in 3 counties," he said. "The attorney told me last month that opposing counsel has started asking if you're involved before they decide whether to contest anything." She blinked. "He didn't tell me that." "I asked him not to. I didn't want it going to your head." "Caleb Rourke," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice carried everything it had accumulated across 6 months of being said in every possible register, sharply, gently, with laughter, with fear in the dark of a study, when everything was close and real and unmanaged. He heard all of it. She could see him hear it. "It's already too late," he said. "It went to your head the moment you corrected my ledger in 8 minutes. 6, she said. "There it is," he said. Summer on the ranch was a different world from winter. Eleanor had known cold Montana, the kind that presses into everything that defines the character of the land and the people on it. She learned hot Montana that summer, and found it equally uncompromising and equally beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are completely honestly themselves without apology. The work expanded with the season. The ranch hands were more numerous. The days were longer. The correspondence multiplied, the grazing contracts came into their renegotiated forms and held, and the north parcel that now carried Eleanor's name on its deed turned out to be the most productive pasture on the property, which she noted with satisfaction, and he noted with the particular expression of a man who knew better than to say "I told you so" to Eleanor Hart, and had decided to simply look it. She was happy. This was the word she kept returning to, tested against the available evidence confirmed. Not the happiness of resolution, not the relief of survival, which she had mistaken for happiness for 3 years and knew better now, but the happiness of a life actively, presently, fully inhabited. It was noisier than she'd expected, more argumentative, more laughing. She had not known how much she missed laughing until she had someone to laugh with, and it turned out that Caleb Rourke, once the walls had come down far enough, was funny in the dry, economical way of a man who observes everything and has simply been waiting for someone worth sharing the observations with. She told him this one evening in late July, sitting on the porch in the last of the light, and he said, "You talk about my walls as though they're gone. Aren't they?" "Relocated," he said. I moved them to somewhere more useful. Around what? He looked at her. The things worth protecting, he said. Instead of the things I was afraid of losing. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The evening came in off the mountains, in its slow, certain way, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that requires complete trust to hold the trust that silence between two people is not distance, but its opposite. She knew before she told him. She had suspected for 2 weeks, confirmed it in her own methodical way, sat with the knowledge for 4 days while she decided how she felt about it, and found to her own quiet amazement that how she felt about it was certain. Not frightened, or not only frightened. Certain in the larger sense, the way she was certain about things that were true, and real, and worth being true. She told him on a Sunday morning in August at the breakfast table directly without preamble, which was the only way she knew how to tell anyone anything that mattered. Caleb went very still. This was not his managed stillness, not the controlled, armored quality she had learned to read through in the early months. This was a different stillness entirely. The stillness of a man who has been handed something so large that his entire system has paused to make room for it. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am always certain before I speak," she said. He stood up from the table. She watched him waiting for whatever came next, genuinely uncertain, which was rare enough for her that she noticed it. He came around the table and stood in front of her and put both hands on her face and looked at her. And his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Every layer gone. Nothing between the feeling and the face, and what she saw there was not what she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected, because she had not let herself expect anything. What she saw was joy. Uncomplicated, complete, the kind that has no management in it, because no management was needed. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, both of them very still, the breakfast going cold on the table, and the ranch beginning its morning noise outside, and Mrs. Calloway almost certainly aware of everything through the kitchen wall. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you terrified?" he said. "Completely." "Good," she said. "That means we understand what it's worth." He pulled back enough to look at her. That joy still present, accompanied now by something steadier underneath it, the look of a man who has decided something absolutely and intends to hold to it absolutely. "We'll do this right," he said. "We've been doing things right for 8 months, she said. "I don't expect us to stop now. I mean," he searched for it. "I mean, this child is going to know both things. The land and the books, the work and the argument. Everything you know and everything I know." "That's a great deal to know," she said. "Good," he said. "It's a hard world. Better to be prepared." She laughed, and he laughed, and Mrs. Calloway appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that contained a full year's worth of carefully maintained neutrality, releasing all at once into something warm and certain and thoroughly unsurprised. And she said simply, "I'll make more coffee," and went back inside. The pregnancy was not uncomplicated, because Eleanor Hart did not do things by halves, and apparently neither did her body. The autumn was difficult, not dangerously so, but enough that Dr. Hennessy from Dural made the trip to the ranch 3 times in October, and told Caleb things that sent him to Eleanor with a carefully neutral expression that she saw through completely every single time. "He told you to make me rest," she said the second visit. "He told me to encourage you to rest," Caleb said with the particular precision of a man who has been living with Eleanor long enough to know the difference matters. "And are you—" "I'm informing you that rest is a medically recommended option," he said, "and then I'm waiting to see what you do with that information." "That is the most intelligent thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I've had good instruction," he said. She rested. Not as much as Hennessy wanted, more than she'd planned to, enough that it worked. She moved the desk to the bedroom for 2 weeks in November, and managed the ranch correspondence from there. and argued with Caleb about the south pasture water allocation through the bedroom doorway, while he stood in the hall with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who knows he is right about something, and has accepted that being right is not the same as winning. "You can come in," she said. "I'm not contagious. You're supposed to be resting." "I can discuss water allocation horizontally," she said. "It requires no particular physical exertion." He came in, sat on the edge of the bed. They discussed the water allocation. Then they stopped discussing the water allocation and sat in the November quiet of the room with the sound of the ranch outside and his hand over hers on the quilt. And neither of them talked for a while, which had become one of Eleanor's favorite things about her life, that the silences had somewhere to land. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Not about the water allocation." "Of what specifically?" she said, though she knew. "All of it," he said. "Any of it." She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I'm afraid of not being enough," she said. "I have been told in many ways and by many people that I am too much of certain things and not enough of others, and I have mostly stopped believing them. But fear doesn't always require belief. It just requires an old enough voice." "You are enough," he said. Flat and certain, the way he said things he had decided completely about. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you about the fear not agreeing with it." "I know," he said. "I'm not agreeing with it either. I'm just—" He looked at her hand under his. "Saying it. Because you said it once that what you needed was to be seen accurately. And accurately, Eleanor, you are more than enough. For this. For all of it. I have watched you be more than enough every day for almost a year, and I intend to keep watching until you don't need me to say it anymore." She was quiet for a moment. "That may take some time," she said. "I have time," he said. "I have the rest of my life as it happens." She turned her hand over under his, held it. "So do I," she said. Hope was born on a February morning, 1 year and 2 months after Eleanor Hart had pressed a pen down hard on a contract she hadn't finished reading and told herself it didn't matter what the words said. It had mattered. All of it had mattered. Every word, every silence, every argument, and every evening in the study, and every moment on the rope at the ravine's edge, and every letter burned and every letter kept. All of it had been the words of a different kind of contract, written not on paper, but in the actual substance of two people choosing repeatedly and without guarantee to stay. Hope arrived the way important things arrive, difficult and irreversible, and more real than anything that came before. Dr. Hennessy was there. Mrs. Calloway was there, efficient and warm, and quietly crying in the way of a woman who has been waiting for this particular morning for a long time. Caleb was there. He had asked to be, and Eleanor had said, "Of course you're going to be here." And he had held her hand through the long hours of it, with the steady, silent presence of a man who understands that some things cannot be fixed, or managed, or solved, and that the only thing required of him is to remain, and he remained. When it was over, when the small, furious, entirely real person had announced herself to the Montana morning, Caleb held her with the careful astonishment of a man who has built his entire life around land and work, and the concrete certainty of things he could see and measure, and is now holding something so small and so absolute that every measurement he knows is insufficient. "Hope," Eleanor said from where she lay. Her voice was tired and certain in equal measure. "Hope," he repeated. Looked at Eleanor. Something moved across his face, the full weight of the year, all of it arriving at once in the particular way that completion arrives, not loudly, but completely. "You chose that." "We chose that," she said. He carried the baby to where she lay and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and they looked at the small face together, the face that had not yet decided what it thought about the world, and was taking its time making the assessment, which Eleanor considered an excellent beginning. "She's going to be trouble," Caleb said. "She comes by it honestly," Eleanor said. From which side? Both, Eleanor said. Equally. Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation, made her satisfied, sound the deepest and most complete version of it Eleanor had ever heard, and withdrew without a word. Outside February did what February in Montana does, which is to say, it pressed its full weight against everything and tested what held. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The land was frozen and would thaw and would freeze again and would thaw again, the way it always had, indifferent to the particular human dramas conducted above it. Patient with the long view, in the way that only very old things can be patient. Inside, Caleb Rourke held his daughter and sat beside his wife and felt the walls he had spent 4 years building and 1 year carefully, deliberately choosing to come down from, felt them not as ruins, but as material. Stone, you have already cut, can be used to build something better than what it was. Eleanor looked at the two of them and thought about a schoolroom in Boston she had loved and lost. About a letter she had answered because she had nothing left to lose. About a man who had turned his back on her the moment she signed her name and had spent the rest of the year slowly, painfully, honestly learning to turn toward her instead. About a notebook full of observations she had stopped needing to write, because the distance that required them had closed. She thought about what it meant to survive, and what it meant to live, and how she had spent 3 years mistaking one for the other, and how a contract she hadn't finished reading had given her in the end not just survival, but everything survival was supposed to be in service of. Hope made a small sound. Caleb adjusted his hold with the instinctive competence of a man who learns things quickly when they matter. Eleanor put her hand on her daughter's head, so small under her palm, so entirely present and real, and here. Some legacies are written in deeds and property lines and the names on legal documents. Some are written in the choices two broken people make over and over in the ordinary daily work of refusing to abandon each other in burned letters and water rights and books given without ceremony and a rope held tight at a ravine's edge in a blizzard and a hand reached across a kitchen table on a morning when it mattered most. Eleanor Hart had come to Montana with nothing left to lose. She had been wrong about that. She'd had everything left to lose, she simply hadn't known yet what everything looked like. Now she did, and she was not letting go.